Amen. Well, what a wonderful video that was from all of our musicians and their families. We're so grateful for each of them for being part of it. Stephanie Pepin in particular for being a part of this service here in the live stream too. We continue in the Heroes for Hard Times series, and we're going to move on in Judges a little bit to the 4th chapter where we read these words. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes settled. She sent for Barak, son of Aboniam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, lead them up to Mount Tabor. And I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the river Kishon, and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, and there Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command, and Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zanaim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Aboniam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And at Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. It was a time of great unsettledness in Israel. One of those periods in life which all of us can sometimes fall into, the ones where we're not quite where we want to be, but we're no longer in the relative comfort of where we used to be either. Sort of like right now. Even though Joshua had brought the children of Israel into the promised land of Canaan some 200 years earlier, overcoming the city-states that controlled the largest part of it, by the 13th century before Christ, the Israelites had still never quite gotten around to completing the task which Joshua had led them in. They held the hill country, yes, but they were unable to drive their Canaanite neighbors from the coastal plains, the most high-value part of Canaan, with its productive grain fields and international trade routes. And that proved to be a continuing source of aggravation and attack. It made Israel into a relatively easy prey for its enemies, who were all still right there. We could say, in fact, that far from enjoying the promised land, they were just one more player among many in the free-for-all that was vying for control of that land. But more importantly, the people of God still didn't have their own act in any way together. They hadn't figured out how to get past their own selfishness, govern themselves in any lasting corporate way. For instance, the writer of the book of Judges will tell us at several places, beginning in chapter 17, in those days, the people of Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. I've served some churches like that over the years. And the result of such an intense deification of personal liberty, a little like some folks do today, I fear, was sadly predictable. Most of all, the Israelites were ripe for disaster because they seemed to constantly forget the Lord to whom they belonged, violating the covenant which had been laid down for them, even joining in the abominable practices of Baal worship, following their pagan neighbors and looking to an idol for the provision of rain for their wheat fields. Now, they had their moments, I suppose. For some 80 years, in fact, just before the time of our story this day, Israel had lived in relative peace under the left-handed leader named Ehud. Judges 3 is careful to tell us that little small detail about Ehud, by the way, as though people who are left-handed are somehow surprises to us when they turn out to be competent or even superior, as they often do. But after Ehud died, so chapter 4 in Judges begins, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Specifically, they turned back to idolatry. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, a king of Canaan, who reigned at Hatzor. Hatzor had once been the largest city in ancient Palestine until Joshua defeated its armies and burned it to the ground. You might have thought that would have been the end of Hatzor, but it wasn't. Those Canaanites rebuilt their city. By the time of Judges 4, it was once again quite an impressive stronghold, dominated the whole upper Galilee region, heavily fortified with stone and brick walls, some as wide as 24 feet. And the Jabin who ruled it, Jabin was kind of a dynastic name like Pharaoh or Caesar. That Jabin was apparently a very cruel and ruthless oppressor of the Israelites, a tyrant who solidified his control with the help of 900 chariots made of iron. Chariots were the ultimate weapon in the ancient world, not only useful to terrorize enemies, but to decimate them once you had them on the run. And 900 chariots, we might note, was about 900 more than the Israelites had. 20 years thus, after the death of Ehud, Jabin and his favorite general, a man named Sisera, lived over closer to Mount Carmel, oppressed the Israelites. Travel was nearly impossible, Judges 5, 6, and 7 tells us. The highways were abandoned. The Israelites were afraid to farm. They were afraid to live in anything but a walled city. And the brutal Canaanite religion, which featured child sacrifice and temple prostitution, marred both the physical and the spiritual landscape of what was supposed to have been God's promised land. Till the Israelites finally did what God had wanted them to do all along, I think. They cried out to the Lord for help. Isn't it amazing how often God has to use the circumstances of our lives to get our attention, to refocus our eyes upon Him? Isn't it sad that sometimes you and I think a whole lot more about God when we're the ones who are oppressed or persecuted or in trouble than we do when we're not? Or even worse, when we're the ones who are oppressing someone else. That's what it was with the Israelites. They were in a sorry state, purely and simply because of their own sin. Judges 4:1 is pretty clear on that. God sold them into the hands of Jabin. But when they cried to the Lord for help, in His mercy, He heard their cry. Only what a surprise his response to them must have been. For to go up against the mighty Jabin and his powerful Canaanites and the brutal general Sisera with their 900 chariots, the Lord raised up a woman who was named Deborah. She was the wife, so we are told, of a man named Lapidoth. I think we should really say Lapidoth was the husband of Deborah. Clearly, she was the one to whom others looked. She was the first and only female judge whom Israel was ever to have. She's the only woman in the whole Bible who is placed at the heart of the political power by both the consent of the people and by the provision of God. That's part of what makes her such an interesting character, one who definitely seems to fit into our Heroes of Hard Times series. The language in the Hebrew Bible specifies she was not a prophetess. That's a little dismissive, sort of like saying stewardess or hostess. The Hebrew is really clear. She was a prophet woman, Isha Naba'ah. She's not alone in that designation, by the way. We might note just in passing that there are at least 4 other women called to function as prophets in the Old Testament, including Miriam, Huldah, whose gates Jesus would have passed through every time he was in the holy city, Jerusalem, Isaiah's wife, and a woman named Noadiah. She was a false prophet, mentioned Nehemiah 6:14. Now, Deborah's not otherwise physically described, of course, but the artist Mark Schall has depicted her in the same way that Frederick Buechner, the biblical scholar, has written about her, suggesting that in his mind's eye, Deborah resembled an ancient Golda Meir, the former prime minister of Israel, a strong woman who did her business under the palm tree, only with what Buechner calls pronounced feminist sympathies. The ancient rabbis used to say that her name bears a strong resemblance in the Hebrew language to the word for bee, suggesting that if you really want to sum up Deborah in 2 words, it's not too far off to simply call her Queen Bee, for she was. She settled whatever disputes her countrymen brought to her. She was good at it. And one day she summoned Barak, perhaps the best warrior Israel had at the time. His name meant lightning, no less. She told him that the Lord wanted him to get up a force of 10,000 men, take them to the top of Mount Tabor, where God was going to give Sisera, the commander of Jabin's armies, into his hands. Barak not only listened to Deborah, his response was to say, "I'll go if you go. If you don't, I won't." Now, that's not because Barak was afraid. He was a very powerful man of faith and courage. He shows up, for example, in the Hebrews Hall of Fame. Hebrews that talks about all those in the Old Testament. As mighty as he was, however, he knew that Deborah, no matter her gender, was even stronger than he was, because she was the one who had been called. I've got to be really clear on this. Deborah wasn't God's plan B, because none of the men were willing to step up, step forward. That's sometimes been said by those who don't believe women ought to be in ministry, leadership. Deborah was plan A all along. And despite the fact that in the ancient world women were not usually viewed as military leaders, Deborah knew how to trust the Lord. And that's what it really comes down to sometimes, isn't it? If you trust the Lord, then even when the circumstances around you seem rather unpromising, maybe even ridiculously impossible, God has a funny way of bringing his deliverance to his people. It was an odd strategy, so the Lord told Deborah to tell Barak to follow. Go get your men and gather them up on Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is a large dome, a little flat top of it. It rises about 2,000 feet above the Jezreel Valley. That flat summit commands a view of the Jezreel Valley, the plain of Esdraelon to the southwest, and the Kishon River, which is oftentimes just a dry river bed, flows down its slopes leading out to the Mediterranean near Carmel. Its elevation thus favored whoever held it with command and control, advantages that were unavailable to those on the plain below. And the steep and wooded sides of Mount Tabor served to keep the Canaanite chariots away from the more lightly armed Israelite foot soldiers. But to actually win the war, you'd have to come down from the mountain, wouldn't you? And Sisera, the commander of the Canaanites, knew that. He knew that when they came down, it was his advantage. He positioned his chariots and his armies in a place that favored his capabilities. He lined them all up in the Jezreel Valley, a sprawling plain that is practically flat on level ground, where his chariots, perhaps with iron skies protruding from the axles, could maximize their attack, mowing down their foes like harvesting barley. And then Sisera waited, for he knew that Barak and the Israelites would eventually have to descend from that mountain where they gathered themselves. Sure enough, at the Lord's command, Barak and his 10,000 soldiers charged off the flanks of Mount Tabor down to the valley below, where Sisera and his chariots were waiting to begin the slaughter. And I wonder if at that very moment any of them thought, this is suicide. What is Barak doing? Why are we listening to that woman, Deborah? What could she possibly know about military strategy? Maybe not much. But again, she knew the Lord. She knew she could trust him. I have a feeling Deborah wasn't at all surprised when the Israelites reached the battlefield that something quite unexpected then happened. Judges 4:15 tells us that the Lord routed the opposition. That's the same language used to describe what the Lord did to the Egyptians at the Red Sea. That should be a clue, I think. Even though chapter 4 doesn't tell us exactly how it happened, the poetic version of this tale in the following chapter does. It says simply that even though it was the traditional dry season of the year, that the Lord provided an unexpected downpour that caused the Kishon River to overflow and to flood the valley floor. The Lord marched out. The earth shook. The heavens poured. The clouds poured down water, so Judges 5:5 tells us. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, adds that storms of sleet and hail burst over the plain from the east, in fact. So when the rain began and those 900 chariots of iron became hopelessly mired in the mud, Sisera and his soldiers quickly abandoned their mini battle tanks. They started to run for their lives on foot, where the Israelites were easily able to defeat them. Our friend Jack Beck, who will be our special guest for the live stream next Sunday, puts it this way in his analysis of this chapter. He says, so God directed a victory for Israel at a most unlikely place, in a most unlikely way, at a most unlikely time, with most unlikely leaders, revealing that the battle belonged to the Lord. May I tell you, my friends, it still does. There was a lot of work to be done, that's for sure. Read the rest of this chapter after worship is over, not while you're eating lunch. Just a little heads up, in case you've already read it, a heads off maybe. You'll find out exactly what happened to Sisera, who was indeed defeated for good at the hands of another woman who enters this story. Here's all we really need to know. In a time of unsettledness, in a period in which Israel's sins had brought judgment and defeat upon them, when they had willfully and intentionally gone over to the other side and were participating in horrific acts of idolatry, God raised up a most unlikely hero. And between her and Barak, that is to say, between Queen Bee and Old Lightning, Israel found deliverance once more. In the song about all this that follows in Judges 5, it is said that it took Deborah, a mother in Israel, to deliver the victory. Now, we don't know if that means Deborah was a biological mother or the word is simply being used as a metaphor, a mother to the nation, perhaps. I suspect it was both. I learned long ago never to underestimate the tenacity of a woman when it comes to protecting her children or her people. Like the love of God that we sang of earlier, their love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on the ones whom they love. Tony Campolo used to speak many years ago of how he and his wife Peggy were at a rather sophisticated academic gathering at the University of Pennsylvania. It was the kind of gathering most people would find really stuffy and kind of pretentious. Academics can do that sometimes. A woman colleague of his struck up a conversation with his wife Peggy, and then she asked in rather condescending fashion, "And what is it that you do, my dear?" And Peggy Campolo, without missing a beat, replied, "I'm socializing two Homo sapiens into the dominant values of the Judeo-Christian tradition in order that they might become the instruments for the transformation of the social order into the kind of eschatological utopia that God willed from it from the beginning of creation." And then Peggy asked politely and sweetly, "And what is it that you do?" The woman said, I'm just a professor." See, whether you're a professor, a professional, a part-time laborer, whether you're a mother or not, whether you're married or single, whether you're a student or a stay-at-home parent, it doesn't matter because there are no insignificant jobs in God's kingdom. It's pretty clear all through the Bible. God chooses to work through ordinary people like mothers and fathers and grandparents and friends and aunts and uncles and teachers and coaches, sometimes even preachers, people like you and me. Regardless of our gender, our ethnic identity, our background, our race, our natural talents, our physical abilities. To be sure, it's not that he needs us or that we're the backup plan for those who haven't responded as they should have. It's that God uses whoever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. So on this most peculiar of all Mother's Days, when so many are not even able to go visit their mothers, should they still be with us? Like that mother in Israel, Deborah, may you step up and step into whatever role God has summoned you to serve. Now, I suspect you did not wake up this morning thinking about being a hero. But as we've come to see in recent days, not all heroes wear capes. Some of them wear scrubs. Not all leaders have crowns. Some of them have face masks. We may not have a successful plan to defeat our enemies, including the coronavirus that's decimated so many. We ought never to discount our God, who can send a rainstorm when he needs to, who can bog down in the mud all those mighty chariots going up against us. Judges 4:24 and 5:31 tell us that when the Canaanite oppression was over at last, peace prevailed for 40 years. Perhaps this is the day the Lord has given us our enemies into our hands as well. We can be sure that he's gone ahead of us. Perhaps this is the day the Lord has called you to be a hero in hard times. Just know this. Whoever you are not plan B. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.